This is the Shock, Stresses, and Building Resilience breakout group. We have just a short amount of time, but we are really happy to help moderate this discussion. I'm Alex Ruane, and we also have Wolfram Schlenker here. And we have basically the task of building off of the presentations both yesterday and today, thinking about kind of how we might reimagine a future food system based on kind of having a stronger resilience to shocks and stresses. There are many, many motivating factors, but this is the one that we are trying to kind of take on today. All right, clearly my PowerPoint is not helping. So let me see if I can sort that out. Wolfram, I'm throwing it back to you since apparently I can't get that second slide up. So yeah, thanks. So here are the questions that we're planning on taking on. We figured I would make some initial comments, try to do some provocative statements to generate some discussion, then I'll turn over to Wolfram to do the same. But really the bulk of this is intended to hear from all of you. We know that in the virtual space, it's a little bit more difficult to have a conversation, but this is a relatively small group. We have about 30 people online right now. So I would encourage people to be bold, and you can put or you can put your comments in the chat. If you really want to speak, you could just raise your hand, or you could put a note in the chat saying, I'd like to speak, or in some places, the easiest thing to do is you just put an exclamation mark like this, and that tells me that you want to speak. So the nice thing about that is it also keeps in order. So yeah, so let's think about the food system when it comes to shocks and stresses. And those who were on yesterday and saw my presentation will remember that within AgMIP, we have models that have been designed around specific components of the food system for the most part. Like we have very good field scale process-based crop models. We have groups that work on the equilibrium kind of settling of global economics markets. We have people who focus on nutrition and household consumption. Where we get really challenged is in those system breakdowns where the feedback loops or the connection between these components, are really the source of problems. So we could think a little bit about what are the barriers. One of the barriers to effective change being that right now we understand the food system in the sense that we can draw the beautiful infographics that you've seen all morning. We can talk about transformation. You can see the pie charts and the pizza diagrams and all these things that suggest mechanisms to do that. But the question is, how do we sort out actual solutions from the large number of possible solutions? And at a certain point, we need the data, and we need some ability to test drive or explore the likely ramifications of these things in a modeled or some kind of scientific environment before the billions of dollars and many lives are affected by rolling out the actual implementations. So what I'm advocating here is, what are the kind of modeling setups or initial questions that we think models can help us answer around transforming food systems, so that hopefully we can kind of explore that not yet existent space before we go too far, and avoid pitfalls or kind of detrimental attempts at adaptation. So maybe the last comment I'll make is just I would also like to separate in some of our conversations responsive or reactive actions compared to proactive. And that can be thought of also in terms of timescales. Are we thinking about creating systems for early warning so that we can respond? Or are we thinking about kind of understanding the long-term changes, and maybe we could have discussions around forewarning and other types of storylines or war game type scenarios where we explore a likely stress or shock under current systems in some future system that we think would respond better. So I'll leave it at that and turn over to Wolfram for his initial comments.
Thank you, Alex. So I'm just going to follow up very quickly here on Alex. And I think there's many different issues. I'm just going to highlight like 3 that I think are pretty important, and then we want to really hear from everybody else. So the first one is sort of, when we talk about shocks and how they can be mitigated. I think historically we didn't have, going back many centuries, we didn't have a lot of trade, and so local shocks really amplified what happened to local population. So trade really helps us these days. That's what Alex said too, with the trade network they have in AgMIP. So, if you have easily plus minus 50% for an individual farm and yields in a year, if you look at the 4 basic commodities, wheat, rice, soybeans, and maize, their basically aggregate calorie output has only deviated by at most 5.7% from a trend. So there's a lot of hedging around the world. And that leads to the next one. We also have a lot of storage, which basically hedges between periods, and that helps us a lot. And there's obviously a lot we can think about, like in a lot of developing countries, storage technologies are not necessarily up to par, and it's harder for them to smooth. There's also, and this is going to the second point, the interdisciplinary one, there's more and more evidence that there's also different institutional arrangements. Oftentimes there's forms of risk sharing about communities, but then it also means if you have a really good bumper crop, you're expected to share with your fellow residents in a town, and what is then this implication for like saving something for the next period? How much do you save for yourself versus the community? And then finally, I think one thing as an economist, as Cynthia emphasized, I'm an economist, I really sometimes feel doesn't get enough attention is the role of export restrictions. So trade works really well, storage works really well to buffer us against shocks. But what we've seen in the last food price spikes in the early 2000s is that several countries put on export restrictions. And that basically, if stores and other people are aware of those potential export restrictions, it takes away their entire incentive to basically save for bad times, because they're not allowed to then distribute it anymore. So I think that's one important policy angle, that sort of institutional arrangement we could sort of negotiate through agreements pretty easily, and it's one of the important things to sort of smooth out individualistic shocks in particular countries. And the other thing, so Kai can say more about this, he works on this from an interdisciplinary perspective too, is whether we actually with climate change get a higher correlation of shocks between bread baskets, which would basically take away the smoothing that I emphasized at the beginning. But that's like one of the interdisciplinary things that I think is very interesting to look at. But I'm more interested now to hear from all the participants. If you introduce yourself quickly, your background and what your hypotheses are, we'd love to hear from you.
All right, thank you, Wolfram. So yeah, I think maybe we'll now turn the microphone over towards others, and you can reflect on some of the comments we've already made, or if you have ideas or other kind of burning questions, now would be a great time to do it. And maybe I'll throw one more bullet, kind of into number 2 here, which is because we do have this connection in today's session to the new climate school at Columbia University. And we know that there are similar efforts to kind of break down disciplinary barriers in other schools. What are those classical departments or disciplines that need to collaborate here? And what are those kind of unique connections that would open the doors to a more kind of productive future? So any comments or questions from the group? All right, I see a comment from Andy. Thanks for getting it started. I was just skimming through the participant list, and I know we have some great minds online here, so let's keep this going. So yeah, policy barriers are in scope. I think it would be great, Andy, to hear your perspectives on that, please. You can grab the microphone.
Great, thanks. I've done. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
I think that's yes. Yeah, great. I mean, it was just a quick one, really. Just the first thing I thought when I saw that first question was, so sorry, introductions. I'm Andy Challoner from University of Leeds in the UK, and I led the chapter last time round and this time round on the international dimensions of climate change in the UK climate change risk assessment. So this is about risk cascades and primarily, well, a large part of it last time round was food, this time also, but there's a whole bunch of other stuff coming into it. And one thing that, well, maybe it didn't surprise me, was that when we released the report, we got the comments back from the government. They said we agree with the conclusions on food security, with the exception of some of those on on shocks, and essentially they said they took a more optimistic view of the function of markets than we did. So this, to me, this is the barrier of actually politicians, government recognizing the need for action, understanding what well, we've already Wolfram mentioned export bans, understanding what the impact of that is. So it's just because I think there's some work to be done at least in the UK, and maybe I sense that might be the same elsewhere. And funnily enough, the day that well, around about the time the government response was finally published was when we just had a big event here with the jet stream going all wibbly, which was actually to do with, which was a climate event which disrupted production in the south of Spain, and we had a shortage of salads, lettuce, various things in supermarkets. So I pointed that out to them a few times, to various people, but I'm not sure how much it's helped. So sorry, long-winded way of saying, is there a barrier here with regards to policy and convincing government and government departments of the need for action? Over.
Yeah, Andy, thanks for the question. And from what I just heard, there are two barriers, which is policy and policymakers at times. And maybe one thing for us to think about is, you know, there are trade flow models that can have different resistances in trade flow that could be shifted to reflect tariffs or other restrictions. But I think the other comment that I want to pick up on is this idea of there are these historical examples, and oftentimes the historical examples are modeled, are examined from a data standpoint, but there is the potential to go back in a kind of hindcast mode as well as in some kind of counterfactual mode. In the climate change community, we're used to talking about detection and attribution, basically saying, is climate change driving this strange weather event? Likewise, we can go back and say, to what extent did various climate factors cause a food shock or a production decrease? And there are some great examples of this in terms of a kind of surprise low production of wheat in southern France a couple years back, and others that you just described. And it's interesting to think that part of what we need to do is demonstrate what we can capture, but also demonstrate that with these models, we may be able to go back and prove that an alternative system or an alternative intervention could have changed those things. And that as we demonstrate that, it may provide stronger ground for us to say, okay, now let's go to the future and change that risk profile through actions in terms of resilience.
Yeah, so I want to chime in too. And he raised a really important point. So I think, you know, the US has this really huge dominant share in like maize, for example, and soybeans, about 40% of the world's production. And one big distortion in policy we have here is subsidized crop insurance. So that gives farmers a disincentive to do sometimes everything they can to limit production shortfalls because they get basically bailed out by the government. It's like a moral hazard problem, like any insurance. So that's one thing that people have talked about for many years, is whether you can sort of take away I mean, on one hand, you want to help farmers out. I understand the rationale, but do you weather index them or do you other things? Or do you based on the county yield, not your own yield? But there is a disincentive to do everything you can to limit production shortfalls, which has a big effect on global prices, just giving the market share of the US. And I think similar policy exists in other countries. So I think that's and sort of to Andy's point, I think theoretically, if you run a storage model and all that, yes, the market should work very well, but there are these real world deviations from the perfect market that we have to incorporate in our model, whether it's subsidized crop insurance or other things. And I think that's a thing we should push on, because that's something that governments could work on by reforming their particular policies.
So if there are more comments on that, people can throw it in the chat. But in the meantime, I want to pick up on Gopal Kakani's question. So Gopal, actually, it would be even better if you could jump in, grab the microphone, and give a quick introduction and ask a question.
Thanks, Alex. This is Gopal Kakani at Oklahoma State University. I'm a professor here dealing with climate, crops, and energy. So this question, looking at, say, because we have these different modeling groups all the way from, say, the genetics, and then the economic groups, and then the policy, and say the nutritionists and everybody involved in trying to solve this food security issue. So in terms of how we define or how we refer to a particular stressor or a shock is different from a plant scientist to a nutritionist to a policymaker. So the transfer of this or communication between these different fields often poses a problem in terms of bringing them together to a common table and then addressing the issue. So that's where I was coming in terms of what sort of a common language can we adapt to talk across disciplines or across different sectors.
Thanks, Gopal. Yeah, I'll share one quick anecdote. The very first AgMIP global workshop back in 2010, one of my strongest memories from that was realizing that the word baseline meant a very different thing to a climate scientist as it did to an economist. Just a quick reminder of that. So basically, climate scientists use baseline to represent current climate, which is compared to some future climate, whereas economists often use baseline to indicate some future pathway which can be disrupted according to a policy or environmental stress or things like that. So it would be comparing basically a future baseline against an alternative future. It took us about 3 days to figure that out and realize that we were talking past each other. And we used that example to kind of underscore that there are these big challenges in interdisciplinary work that we have to figure out. And in this case, another one is shock. Shock really means different things to different people. To some people, it has a very strong implication of a tipping point or an acute episodic kind of event, whereas in other cases, it's considered a large-scale deviation, which could be very slow in its onset. So yeah, I very much agree that there is a challenge in terms of understanding what we can say and making sure that these are not just once a year interactions, but really build up people with a functioning close engagement in terms of their research collaborations so that these conversations can be had. All right, Sento, please.
Sento Assing, University of Florida. I'm a crop modeler. I want to pick up on barriers and also on the historical events there, which I think could really help us to put some light in what's going on. And I'm wondering what are the barriers or what's missing actually to fully understand how a shock has an implication on the final food system. Coming back to these examples, which I already mentioned, the 2010 one, which was sort of caused by heat and drought in Russia, which I think from a crop modeling point of view, we should be able to deal with this. We should be able to describe this. In terms of climate projection, seasonal projection, I think even the climate community might be able at least to forecast some of that. With that, we could have probably shown what's happening there. But then the next step was policy and trade. And I'm not sure how much the trade modelers take these policies into account, because as we know, in 2010, the Russians decided to close their market and had all these down-ribbling effects there, whereas in 2012, they had almost the same drought and heat again, with the same consequences. The production of wheat collapsed almost the same as in 2010, but they didn't close the market. And it didn't do anything similar to what we have seen in 2010, for instance, with North Africa, which sort of is a big importer of Russian wheat. So for me, these are barriers, but then there are also opportunities of trying to bring these three parts together, which is, I think, AgMIP is about: the climate, the crop modeling, and economic and trade modeling. But I don't know enough about it. Maybe there's even more possible, because some of these policy decisions might be even also be possible to model it in terms of if any country has a production loss of more than X%, they are likely to close it down. But then it still leaves the question, Why did they close it down in 2010 and not in 2012? If I can say one more thing, having said this, it gets more complicated. You also, Alex, you mentioned the 2016 France. France is only, it's almost the same sort of production size as Russia. They had a huge production collapse in 2016, which nobody really could forecast, but it also had no really visible implications on the trade market. So there are some examples out there in terms of production size are similar, but the consequences are very different. And for me, that's a question of how much do we really know about trade modeling, and how policy might come in there.
Thanks, Antal. Yeah, this is these are big challenges, and I remember having a similar look back at trying to find correlations between kind of famine and production shortfalls and weather events, and it's a much more convoluted story than you would originally think, especially when you get to regions and when you realize that there are these systems that kind of provide alternatives. A great case of this, for example, is likewise in Bangladesh, where you can make up for a bad season with the next season of rice when you have 3 seasons during the year. And when one of them is irrigated and doesn't flood, it's much more reliable. And how do you do that? So I think actually one thing I'll take from this is a question about replacement. I don't think we think about this concept to the extent that we could. For example, in the global economic models, there are terms that talk about the cost of replacing French wheat with Argentinian wheat. How well those numbers are constrained, I'm not sure. I think that was a fairly large source of uncertainty in the global economics models, although maybe somebody here could talk about that specifically. But likewise, the diversification of markets, having for some cases, for example, when there is a shortfall of maize for livestock feed, what is that next crop that fills in that gap? We saw when we did our coordinated global and regional assessments, we saw prices of wheat and maize kind of running in parallel in some of those circumstances. So I think there's a lot that we could learn, not only in terms of the cost of replacement, but also in terms of the design of systems, to have something more like a diversified portfolio, maybe make sure that in regions there are crops that do well in dry years, as well as crops that do poorly in dry years, that buffers that. So that could be an interesting concept to explore.
Yeah, I mean, so according to WTO rules, export restrictions are not allowed, right? So the problem is they're often not enforced. We saw that with COVID too. So I would push back a little bit against Santal's suggestion to just model it as a function of a threshold or something. I think there's also a huge, it's not just as simple as that, there's also a huge policy component. How much political pressure there is for countries not to do an export restriction. And I think it's also an opportunity to basically break down this barrier by basically making sure that these bans do not happen, by basically doing better negotiation. And you can even go examples from the past, like when the US in the 80s put on the grain embargo with the Soviet Union. It's often been said that this led sort of a diversification towards Brazil and South America as an alternative growing area by several countries. So I think the strategic reallocation, and it's usually only very short term that it helps your country to basically put on an export restriction. So from a policy perspective, I would hope that we can, through international agreement, negotiate that that these are not being put in place.
So I may turn to our rapporteur here, Kai, to say a word about this extremes, because this is another, I think, barrier, is that we tend to think of extremes as popping up kind of in isolation, but there is increasingly a recognition that large-scale modes of variability and other kind of teleconnections are potentially leading to more situations where you are dealing with multiple stresses at the same time. So I wonder if you just want to say a quick word as to kind of barriers you're trying to knock down or explore in terms of, with that information, what can we do?
Yeah, this has, of course, several. I mean, it's a big field currently. Sorry about the background noise. I hope you can hear me. So, a topic that I'm particularly interested. Oh, sorry. I'll close the door. Particularly interested in currently is, of course, the changes of certain large-scale modes of variability that are associated with persistent patterns in the jet stream. And that is a huge field of research currently, exploring if those episodes become more frequent or if only the impacts become more severe. So these are two different hypotheses, essentially. The circulation response to global warming staying more or less the same, but the heat events that are associated with certain blocking highs also just becoming more severe, and especially for agriculture, which is so much system that has like a threshold behavior that could be very crucial. But there's still the possibility of those strongly meandering jet regimes becoming more frequent, and that is still open to discussion. Often this is linked to like a warming Arctic also, but currently the community has not come to a conclusion yet.
All right, thanks, Kai. Yeah, I think there's potential for scenarios of extremes not to be just localized, but kind of global scenarios. In the past, people just invented them. They said, like in Molly John's Lloyd's of London report, they just invented a flood in India and a drought in the United States and things like that. But now we can actually put some kind of joint probabilities on those things, which is going to open up kind of a new grounding of those types of scenarios. I see a question in the chat from Heidi. And I don't know, Heidi, if you're the engineer or if you're passing on from an engineer, but the question is, it seems difficult to imagine that the models and research needs are, or what they will be without knowing what the knowledge demands are. So there's a question, I guess, to the group of what are these big questions? Is it about just profitability? Is it about migration, conflict, political stability? Certainly with those last ones, food security and agricultural outcomes in rural areas is usually just another factor in a much larger set of declining system behaviors. But I wonder if anybody wants to comment on that. Maybe it's a question about what are we actually trying to transform the system to? What are those motivations and kind of metrics for success? I don't think anybody is expecting a future where drought doesn't matter anymore. I think it's more the idea of if we can build safeguards, early warning systems, kind of replacement buffers and other things like that, that could get to the point where the vulnerable populations are identified early enough and the systems are able to adjust and account for that disruption. It's more back to Mark Howden's question of, resilience as an ability to absorb a disturbance. But I see Carolyn has indicated eagerness to speak. Go ahead, please.
Thanks, Alex. Maybe this is a question for Wolfram, but we were talking, since this group is supposed to be thinking about, the shocks, stresses, and resilience building component of reimagining the food system, I'm just wondering if there are examples of cases when sort of political instruments or for example, subsidies and things like that, really work, especially when you're dealing in a situation of trying to improve a food system. And I'm thinking about, you know, how states may have more ability to act sometimes than a national government, or a community can decide that it's going to, you know, advocate for more, you know, anyone who donates. I mean, I'm not sure what the policies or the actions would be, but I just wonder if you have, you know, any examples of when prioritization of a new area for policy and the subsidies to encourage, you know, it's basically an incentive for moving in that direction. Does that sometimes work? I mean, we had a couple of days ago a presentation, which I don't remember the speaker because there's been so many, my apologies, but you know, that for many metropolitan regions that have a large global dependency on their food, you know, they could be well advised to really invest in the food provision from within 100 to 200 mile, you know, radius kind of thing. And you know, clearly that would be a huge startup if it was to work in that way. Anyway, just really a question as to, are there ever cases when subsidies and things like that actually work to beneficial change, or are they usually not too hard to stop so that they're not a good direction to go ever?
I think there might be other people on this call who should weigh in too. I think it depends on the specific problem you're addressing. So I forgot the names, but there's a French research group who basically, I mentioned at the beginning. So if the scope is the local storage for like subsistence farmers, they run experiments in Africa where they provide anonymized or safe storage of harvest to smooth between periods. And that seems to work very well, because there's sort of this, you know, this conflict between risk sharing and saving technologies and so forth. And I try to distinguish between the technological factor of just making it more suitable to storage without rotting versus the communal aspect of sharing your surplus among your fellow village members. So that seems to have large results in sort of inducing more production and sort of smoothing more over time the shocks, so building up more resilience. That's sort of on a very local scale. I think on international scale, you know, we have a lot of trade agreements that seem to work. Like there might have been trade restriction between European countries, but now in the European Union, that's really not expected anymore. Although, to my surprise, under COVID, even that seemed to have for a short term been reimposed. I guess economists are in general skeptical of subsidies because you sort of distort the incentive unless you provide a public good where the farmers wouldn't have the full incentive to do it. So this could be for ecosystem services. So there's a really famous example here in the US where you pay for, you know, conservation payments, which depends on your environmental score, like the Conservation Reserve Program. That seems to have worked in sort of preserving some natural habitat. And maybe as a result also maybe smooth out shocks a little bit. So I think there are several examples of what people can do, but it really depends on your scope, and maybe other people have other examples they want to share.
Gopal, maybe just put in the chat if you're replying to Wolfram's just now. I do want to highlight Phil Alderman also has a really interesting question here, which is shocks are not just on the negative side. It can be on the positive side. There's I would say emerging focus in the climate community on boons, not just hazards, things that can be good. Although it's also worth noting that a huge production increase can at times flood markets and lead to secondary kind of effects. So Gopal, maybe you can speak, and then we'll hear from Heidi, and then we're almost out of time.
Just as trying to look at the shocks in terms, say, for example, you have the downfall in the auto industry, and the bailout of that probably proved successful, rather than probably providing subsidies to the ag sector. Sometimes that wouldn't lead to the same results in terms of rejuvenating the ag sector in the short time frame that you have. So just the thought on comparing the sectors and see how each of these would respond to a shock, and what additional inputs need to be taken care of in revitalizing the shocks in an ag sector.
Thanks, Gopal. Heidi, can I encourage you to grab the microphone and say, you could probably even link your two comments, I'd imagine.
This is Heidi Weber from Zalf in Germany. It was a little bit just to follow on Phil's comment about overproduction, and one comment I just had was the difference between building resilience in, for example, rural farmers. So right now, maybe a large, we focus a lot in my agronomy community of increasing yields and commercializing smallholder farmers. But as yields increase, and they then also become more vulnerable to shock. So at an aggregate level, are there trade-offs between who are more vulnerable than to, for example, production shocks? In the case of intensification, it may actually end up being urban consumers, although you've built the resilience of farmers because they have more savings and an ability to take a production shock. Just to comment.
Thank you, Heidi. And I see we're at 2:15, and we probably should wrap up here. I do want to call out Roberto Valdivia in the comments has also underscored the all-important need for data. A lot of what we've discussed here is only wishful thinking unless there's some data for us to start building models and evaluating the models that exist. So it's an ongoing question of what are those data resources and data initiatives that would allow us to populate this area and build up the scientific basis. So I'll just, as a last word, say thank you to all who participated. I'm sorry this was a little bit crammed here, but I'm really excited to see some of this feedback and have a couple ideas, hopefully that we can turn into AgMIP type protocols and explore into decision-making tools. So Wolfram, any last word from you?
Thank you, everybody.
All right, great. So Kai is on the hook to try to summarize this a little bit. Kai, I'd be happy if you want to send me a chat or something if you have any questions, but I think this is more like a kind of off-the-cuff impressions of what you've seen, and Wolfram and I will jump in if need be. Thank you so much, all. Take care. We have to go back to the plenary link now, so we're going to end this session.